We care about democracy, we care about freedom.
Well, promoting democracy might be true for Iraq. It meant a lot to me to see the Iraqi people voting for the first time in their history. But the region is still rife with kings, emirs, sultans, and sheikhs who regard their countries as their personal property, and we supported many of them. How many of these guys were actually democratically elected?
It's more or less like a hypocrisy. They don't care much about democracy or liberty or what people are doing and so on. They worry about is there an interest in this region or not? What would I get from this? If it's in our interest, the companies, the oil companies and so on, will do it.
So if we are in the Middle East for oil, there would be nothing new about that. Throughout history, all empires have gone where the resources are, and I should know that well. In 1940, Hitler took over Romania for its oil and grain, and after the war, the oil was taken again by the Soviet Union as a war reparation. In the meantime, millions of Romanians were living in dire misery. I guess the same thing happens in our time. Oil is still the most desired resource, and the United States is the largest consumer. So I went to one of the most oil-rich countries in the world, a country that, just like Romania 60 years ago, was invaded for its resource. In 1990, Saddam Hussein took over the small country.
In Kuwait here, we never thought we had an enemy because we're always a peace-loving people. The reason Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait was oil. If Kuwait was an agricultural country, he wouldn't come near us. To him, it was simple greed. And we thought as Kuwaitis that once Saddam did the invasion, that all the other countries will start to come to our rescue. And this was the sad awakening. They didn't. As a matter of fact, some of them took sides with Saddam. The alternative was to go to a superpower. The United States was the alternative.
So the United States intervened and in a matter of months drove the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. Today, Kuwait has almost no military of their own and thousands of American troops on their soil. But does that mean that their oil is plundered?
You know we're riding in style, got our own miracle mile. We'll live just like a millionaire, just buy those houses and cars. We're acting like movie stars, just let these good times roll.
So education became free. School, as you said, up to university, even up to doctorate degree. There's no taxes. And every Kuwaiti family is entitled to apply for either a piece of land or a house.
I was amazed to find out that many Kuwaitis live better than many Americans. And that is because they actually get paid for the oil they sell. When the price of oil goes up, the American people, the taxpayers that fund the defense of Kuwait, pays more just like everybody else. I wonder how many empires throughout history ever paid for the resources they got.
It's not a matter of oil. Americans did not come here just for oil. They can get oil, cheaply from Saddam Hussein. He offered them to sell, a barrel of oil for less than $10. So it is not a matter only of oil when the American came here to liberate us from Saddam Hussein.
So if we didn't come here just to take the oil, why did we come at all? To find out, I needed to learn more about the Arab world. After all, Kuwaitis are only 1 million out of the 500 million Arab people. So next I went to the most populous Arab country, and one that has no oil to sell. Welcome to Egypt. Egypt might be famous for their pyramids and monuments, but I found it to be a troubled country. The population of this country has doubled in only 30 years, and just 5% of its land is usable. While there is some oil, it barely covers this country's own demand. And unlike Kuwait, there is no free housing or education from the government. Sad but true, this is the state of most of the Arab world, the ones that haven't been blessed with oil revenues. While most of the Middle Eastern countries share the same language, culture, and religion, the differences in the standard of living are tremendous and mostly based on the size of the population and oil revenues. So is this the reason for all the wars and violence in this region?
Well, I have argued that the problem in the Middle East isn't a clash of civilizations, it's a civilization of clashes, in the sense that there is a culture there of political violence that is deeply inimical to the emergence of civil society and democracy of the sort that we know in the West.
So you have the Islamists of various kinds on the one level. On the other side, you have the dictatorships, the authoritarian dictatorships. And there hasn't been enough of an opportunity for the development of a moderate middle.
Especially after the invasion of Saddam and so on. People worry about what our neighbor is going to do in the future.
Before, maybe you could live within the boundaries of your wall, you build it high enough, you lock the door, you're safe. But when people start to learn how to jump inside your house or blow the wall to come inside, then it becomes a different deal. You cannot live in seclusion anymore. Everybody is under threat of some sort of the other from his neighbor.
We know we are a defenseless nation, we're a peaceful nation, we're a small nation in a bad neighborhood, in gigantic bad neighborhood. Iran, unfortunately, at this time, is a danger. You know, why does Iran want to have nuclear power? Why does Iran want to go against the rest of the world when it comes to its nuclear program? Could the world be wrong and Iran is right?
In order to be fair, in order to please the people of this region, you have to tell the Israelis probably to leave at least part of the region that they occupied. Look at the wall, for instance, that the Israelis are building now and kicking some people out of their land. What are the Americans doing?
The only occupation in the world now, anywhere in the world, the only occupied land is the Palestinian land, and that's not fair. And America has to do something about it. I realize how dear Israel is to an American's heart, and how the whole culture evolves when it comes to foreign policy to protecting Israel. But you cannot just run the world the way you like it to be. And as a friend of America, I think that it's time for America to address such a coral issue.
Okay, the Middle East is a powder keg, but none of these countries pose a threat to us, and we also have to pay for the oil we get anyway. So I still don't know, why are we here? Let's get a European perspective.
Oil is the point why the Americans start the war in Iraq. And it is the oil that people get killed for over there.
We know that oil is a real problem for us. We have to stay at peace with countries who have oil resources.
You can't put your sons and your kids into war for oil. You should use your head and, for example, make solar energies and all that stuff working.
While the Europeans believe that we are in the Middle East to get the oil, if you look at the distribution, you would find out that the US is not the prime consumer of the Middle Eastern oil. Actually, most of the oil goes to China, Japan, and the European Union that has almost no production of their own.
Europeans have a long history of hypocrisy when it comes to the Middle East. The Europeans need stability in the Middle East. They're as dependent, indeed more dependent on Middle Eastern oil than the United States. But they don't want, they don't all want to pay the quite heavy price of trying to stabilize that region. So when Europeans bleat about American policy in the Middle East, you need to take it with a large grain of salt.
And frankly, they don't see a threat to Middle East oil resources. The Europeans, I think, would like to do work in the Middle East as a business proposition. They're not considering the democratizing of regimes throughout the Middle East, as the United States is doing. They'd much rather try to hold a lid on and just see the Middle East as a source of oil, I think.
Okay, but how about Asia? Japan, the second largest economy in the world, is also the largest consumer of Middle Eastern oil. What is their involvement in the region?
Soon after the Second World War, Japanese emperor went to Japanese Diet, which is Japanese parliament, and gave a speech that from now on, Japan must be a pacifist country, Heiwa Kokka, or peace-oriented country. And Japanese public learned that they shouldn't opt for war, but peace.
But what about China? They're actually the second largest consumer of oil in the world.
China is in the midst of a really vast transformation in its dependence on oil. 20 or so years ago, China was an oil exporter. Within the next 20 years, they're going to be a massive oil importer. China is going to be very sensitive to where their oil comes from and how assured that supply is going to be. It looks like they cannot do but rely overwhelmingly on the Middle East. To get Middle East oil, they need to be assured that the sea lines of communication with the Middle East are open. Right now, the sea lines of communication are open because of U.S. naval power.
We don't think that it's fair for us to just, keep the oil flow going and the rest of the world is just sitting idle and buying oil and not doing anything about keeping the stability and the peace in this region. Therefore, we think that it is a must for America and the rest of the world to really interfere in this region to keep the stability and peace so as the oil could keep on flowing.
So if the United States is not the main beneficiary of the Middle Eastern oil, does it make sense for us to pay alone the price of involvement?
Let me say that what the United States is doing like an antibiotic. You cannot live on antibiotic for life or for good. You have to let these societies settle down, solve their differences and so on. You cannot keep this external factor for good. For instance, if a society, like the Iraqi society now, we're saying that the moment the Americans would withdraw, maybe things would look worse. Maybe things would be worse for some time. But then the leaders of the Iraqi society or community would sit down and say enough is enough, like what happened in Lebanon, for instance. You cannot go on with civil war for good. You cannot stay there and say we are there to protect the world, because you are there, you are spending money, your own soldiers or children are dying every day, and people are not very happy with you. Doesn't make sense.
What would happen should the United States leave the region to its own devices?
Take away the United States, and there's really no way of knowing what's going to happen. If there were no American commitment to the Middle East, if there had never been an American commitment to the Middle East, there would be no state of Israel. I think that's the first and most obvious point. It's very, very hard to imagine such a small state with so few assets surviving without American support. So you'd have to say goodbye to that.
اسرائیل از صحنه روزگار حذف نشود، این فریادها به قوت خود باقی.
Sooner or later, Israel's enemies, including the current regime in Iran, would be able to wage a war against it, that the Israelis would only be able to win at a colossally high price. So that's number one. Number two is, what would the various states in that region do to one another absent the United States. We know that Saddam was capable of waging war against two of his neighbors because he not only invaded Kuwait, but before that he went to war against Iran. We know that Lebanon was ripped apart by its neighbors and turned into a puppet state by Syria. The list goes on and on. And if you take away the United States from this story, it seems to me you don't just have the destruction of Israel, but you then have the self-destruction of the Arab world. It's a very, very volatile part of the world, and it seems to me that those who blame the problems of the Middle East on the United States or on the colonizers before the United States are completely missing the point.
والصهاينة غريبة ومقطع الكيان الله أكبر لو أذن الله لنا يا أمة محمد سيقول حتى الحجر يا مسلم هذا يهودي خلفي أعلى مقامك ونحن نقطعها والله لا نقطعها أيها اليهود الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الجهاد في سبيل الله الجهاد في سبيل الله
The next regional superpower in the Middle East is clearly Iran. Iran is the principal beneficiary of America's generous destruction of its principal rival, Saddam Hussein's Iran. And I think the ambitions of Iran for regional dominance are to be underestimated at our peril. That's why it's so important that Iran not acquire nuclear weapons. Because I think with nuclear weapons, it would be North Korea, but North Korea poised on top of some of the biggest oil reserves in the world.
One day, this very flag will fly over the parliament in London. We will see this flag that will fly over the White House. And we will see the Black House, the Kaaba, will take over the whole world. قد حكمنا الدنيا وسيأتي يوم والله نحكم فيه كل الدنيا. سيأتي اليوم نحكم فيه أمريكا. سيأتي اليوم نحكم فيه بريطانيا ونحكم فيه كل العالم.
Just imagine that those groups, Al-Qaeda for example, take over the power in any country in Saudi Arabia or trying to threaten the situation and the security in the Gulf. So I'm sure that will threaten that flow of oil or export of oil to Western countries.
But America cannot now withdraw from Iraq until they fix Iraq, because if Iraq is not brought to stability and to democracy, then it will be anarchy, and this anarchy would spill all over the region, and I'm not exaggerating if I say all over the world.
An interruption in Middle East oil production and flow would have immediate severe economic dislocation throughout the world. Economy in every level will be affected.
Our allies in Europe would be the first to suffer, but certainly the Asians would suffer, particularly Japan right now, and the future China as well. And we don't understand that this is a globalized economy. So you can't sit there and say, oh, you guys have got problems, we can avoid it. We can't, because oil is an international market, and it doesn't really matter where your oil is from, but if the biggest oil center isn't producing, everybody suffers.
I left the Middle East without an answer. What are our options? Should America stay involved, and at what cost? At this time, the US is losing 2 or 3 soldiers a week. But what if that number was to be 30 or 300? And what's the alternative? A world recession? I think our country could survive that. It has been done, and we emerged stronger than before. But what about the people? Is it right to police the Balkans, but leave the Middle East, just because it's more expensive?
Well, I think the problem is pretty simple. For over 200 years, the people of the world, they looked up to us, the United States of America. And that meant something. We were this great hope of democracy, of freedom. And today, things are a bit different. In fact, they're the opposite. We've had a bit of an image change. People, they dislike us, they even hate us. Why? Because we impose our will on other countries using our military might. Why are we spending your hard-earned tax dollars to support countries like Germany, Japan, South Korea, whose economies are some of the strongest in the world? Why are you paying for their defense? They can afford militaries of their own. For over 60 years, we have opened our markets to them and provided them with free defense. Enough is enough. You know, many people in those countries live better than many Americans. If you elect me as your next president, I will take the savings from our $420 billion annual defense budget, and I will create new jobs. And together, we will build the foundation for a better, stronger America.
The wars of Asia have been over for more than 50 years. Today, Asian countries produce most of the goods we consume, and old enemies are best trading partners. While the 20th century has been known as the American century, this next one will probably be an Asian one. Despite all the peace and prosperity, there is a lot of American military presence and commitments in this region. I set out to find out why.
그러나 난 믿습니다. 우리들이 2배, 3배 더 힘을 내어 일한다면 모두가 부러워하는 공산주의 미상천이 우리 마을에도 일도서리라고 말입니다.
저도 뭔가 힘자라는 걸 덮고 싶군요.
고맙소, 미양동.
나가서 일을 1995년 말부터 일을 시작했었어요. 그런데 한 달을 일하게 되면 내가 내 인건비로서 받을 수 있는 돈이 당시 북한 돈 70원이었어요. 그런데 그 70원으로서 살 수 있는 물건은 쌀 반 킬로 값밖에 안 돼요. 제가 떠날 당시에 우리 집에는 모든 재산과 식량이 식량과 바꿔 먹을 수 있는 것들이 전부 다 팔려나갔고 더 이상 식량과 바꿔 먹을 수 있는 재산이 없었어요. 그래서 먹고 살기 위해서 타러 가게 됐어요. 네, 처음에는 제가 중국으로 가겠다 했을 때 이 모든 걸 아니까 탈출을 하다 잡히면 그 정치범 수용소로 가는 거 알기 때문에 반대했었어요. 잡히게 되면 정치범 수용소라는 감옥으로 가게 돼요. 그런데 이 정치범 수용소라는 감옥은 다른 일반 감옥하고 달라서 석방이라는 개념이 없어요.
우리 아저씨가 외국에서 편지했었는데 후나라는 별나게 본 적 안 돼. 어떻게? 내가 살아있는 동안 온갖 향락을 다 누려야지. 야, 왜 점점 구리대 갈까? 참 한심하지. 희생된 혁명선열들이 지금 살아있었으면 뭐라고 했을까?
그래서 넘어올 때 만약 잡히게 되면 자살할 걸 각오하고 넘어갔죠. 저뿐만 아니라 많은 사람들이 다 그래요. 저희 어머니가 의사였어요. 잡히게 되면 몸 안에 있는 모든 그 자살할 수 있는 도구를 빼앗기잖아요. 그렇기 때문에 어머니로부터 도구 없이 죽는 방법을 배웠어요. 이렇게 머리로 올라가는 양쪽 동맥을 동시에 누르게 되면 사람이 죽게 돼요. 고통 없이 죽게 돼요. 그 방법을 배우고 나왔어요, 어머니한테서. 지금 북한에 저희 어머니와 누나들이 있어요. 그래서 만약 저희 얼굴을 북한 쪽에서 이 방송을 봐서 나라는 사람이 남한에 와 있다는 걸 알면 집안에 추방이 돼요. 정치범 수용소로 끌려갈 수도 있고, 극심한 경우에는 정치범 수용소로 끌려갈 수 있고, 경한 경우에는 감옥으로 가야 돼요. 뿐만 아니라 모든 탈북자들이 바라는 것은 미국이 북한에 대해서 무력으로 공격해서 김정일 정권을 제거해 주기를 학수고대로 바래요. 백성들은 저항을 안 해요. 왜냐하면 이젠 북한 백성들은 다 알거든요. 김정일 정권이 나쁜 정권이라는 걸 알기 때문에 김정일 정권이 허물어지길 바라기 때문에 저항을 안 해요.
Right now, the U.S. Army has about 21,000 soldiers in Korea. The purpose of the U.S. forces in this alliance is to deter North Korean aggression, and should that deterrence fail, then we're prepared to fight and win.
North Korea is as big a threat as a madman with a nuclear bomb can ever be. That's to say, an almost unimaginably big threat. The regime in North Korea is the craziest in the world, it's the least predictable in the world, it's probably the most unstable in the world, and nobody knows what's going to happen next. It could collapse tomorrow, it could go to war tomorrow, it could wipe Seoul off the face of the earth tomorrow. In that sense, there's no bigger threat to global security than North Korea.
They've made numerous incursions across the demilitarized zone. They've made attempts to assassinate and been successful in killing many South Koreans at various locations around the world.
He blew up half their cabinet in Rangoon in 1983. He sabotaged K-858 in 1987 with 115 South Koreans on it. He sent down assassination teams to take out the president. These are violent people.
I understand that the North is still hostile, but if you look at South Korea, they're twice the size in terms of population, and their economy is about 20 times larger. More than that, they benefit of the latest US weapons and training, and they don't seem eager to live under the regime of the dear leader. So why couldn't they defend themselves?
그러니까 북한의 군대가 군대 숫자만 봐도 150만 군대를 유지하고 있고 한국 군대가 67만 명이니까 군대 인원수가 벌써 배로 넘고
ですから朝鮮半島の軍事バランスを考えるときは、
ソウルという1200万人が住んでいる町は北朝鮮の前線からわずか40キロ50キロぐらいで常に北朝鮮の下方の射程の範囲内にあって人質になっている.
게릴라 부대만 30만인데 국군의 절반이 게릴라 부대, 북한의 특수부대. 이런 사람들이 일시에 공격을 하게 되면 한국이 아무리 막강한 군사력을 가지고 있다고 해도 그게 쉽지가 않겠죠. 그러니까 서울을 그냥 밀어버리는 거는 북한이 충분히 수능선이 있다고 생각하거든요.
それと常に攻撃を準備して訓練をして特殊目的部隊を持っている方が最初の1日で相手の半分以上を壊滅することができるという